We know that natives collected maple sap, used it in cooking their dishes and stews, and turned it into maple syrup and maple sugar or maple candy. However, what we don't know is whether that was born out of excess and for fun, or was required in order to survive. Before written history, records are simply born and kept through legend. Further, we don't know whether it's possible to produce a net caloric return from tapping and collecting sap, boiling and producing sugar. It's been said by many survivalists that tapping trees can be done to better a person in a survival situation. Just tap a tree, they say, and it's full of delicious sugars. So it's just assumed to be a good idea to suck sap. But is it really? What we do know about sap flow is that it's best done in the early spring when temperatures fluctuate between around -5 degrees Celsius at night to +5 degrees Celsius during the day, or 20 Fahrenheit at night and 40 Fahrenheit during the day. Sunny conditions also increase sap flow. It follows, therefore, that sap flow is controlled by temperature. In the winter, the sap freezes and lies dormant inside the tree and roots. But as temperatures rise above freezing in the spring, positive pressure develops. If a hole is made in the tree from an axe or spile, sap will escape through the hole or wound. During cooler periods at night, the tree is under negative pressure once again, sucking water up through the roots, thus replenishing the sap in the tree. Sap can also flow during the night if temperatures remain warm, but it is vital to have the cool and warm periods to create sap flow. If temperatures become too warm or too cool, sap flow will be negatively affected. Generally, sap flows for about 6 weeks, but this can be shortened by air temperature. When temperatures rise too high, the tree undergoes changes and the resulting sap becomes unpalatable. This usually happens when the tree begins to bud. Sap only flows through the outer tree, the so-called sapwood. This is the living portion of the tree, and its job is to move water and nutrients from the roots to the branches. The sugar in the sap is a result of photosynthesis, that which occurred during the previous summer. Carbohydrates or sucrose are stored in the tree as starch. This gives sap its sweetness. The distinctive flavoring of the sap is caused by amino acids. On a good day, it's possible to collect 4 to 12 liters or 1 to 3 gallons of sap. That's about 20 to 90 drips per minute. This might sound like a lot, but when you have to boil off the equivalent of 39 units of sap to produce 1 unit of syrup, and even more to produce maple sugar, you're really in it for the long haul. The ideal tree is the sugar maple, but red or black maple will also do. A suitable tree has sap that is around 2% in sugar content, but trees can range from 1 to 5% sugar content. Other maples produce sap from syrup as well, but the results might be less desirable and require more sap to produce the equivalent amount of syrup due to the lower sugar content. The leaves of sugar maple are simple, opposite, 3 to 5 inches long, broad, and usually 5-lobed. The bark is gray to brown, smooth, but break into long irregular plates that loosen along the vertical side as the tree grows larger. Sugar maples frequently grow to 60 to 100 feet tall. Maple sap can be safely stored at less than 3 degrees Celsius, or about 38 degrees Fahrenheit, for about 7 days if it is kept in the shade and packed in snow. After that, it needs to be boiled. Watch for raw sap to turn milky as an indication that it has gone bad. Syrup from sap produces about 260 calories per 100 grams, or if you prefer, about 800 calories per cup. So you would need about 4 cups to return your daily calories of 3,500. That's about 120 pounds of sap, or about 10 trees flowing on the high end. That's not unreasonable, but you also need to boil off 117 pounds of water to produce your syrup. And I'm not even going to calculate how much energy is required to burn off 117 pounds of water, but you're welcome to do that yourself. Nevertheless, boiling off water is a high cost. Processing down sap to syrup through evaporation is where the real labor comes from, so long as you don't count checking, collecting, and moving the sap around, as well as preventing it from spoiling. Boiling down sap is time-consuming, and if you're doing things by hand, highly labor intensive. It's nothing like going to the store and picking up a bottle of syrup and drizzling it over high carbohydrate pancakes and calling it a day. Rather, you must cut, collect, and split wood and then carefully feed it into a pot to boil off the excess water. One might argue that if you have a fire going already, boiling sap is a simple matter. But in survival, you shouldn't be slaving to keep a fire going just for its own sake. Natives would have used communal fires, maintained by tribes, funded through food acquired by much more extensive means than maple syrup, including the most important, agriculture. To make matters even worse, before the arrival of Europeans, natives had no metal tools, not even cast iron pots to help them boil or metal spiles to help direct the drip. They used stone tools to cut a notch into the trunk where it was collected in birch bark containers. From there, hot rocks were dipped into a hollowed out log to boil off the water, an agonizing process to say the least. Another method involves a series of hollowed out logs placed over a slate rock with fire burning underneath. Neither technique was very efficient and required much care so that batches were not spoiled. As an aside, the natives of the Great Lakes region did not have iron because iron deposits were much deeper in the soil and were therefore not discovered as early as it was in the West. To get iron for tools, guns, animal traps, and so forth, the natives traded fur with the Europeans. Cast iron makes the production of maple syrup much more close to something that produces an actual caloric return. Another method of making syrup involves removing the thin layer of ice that forms on the top of the sap solution overnight. The ice forming at the top is mostly water, so it can be discarded, leaving the sugar settled to the bottom. With successive ice removals, the sap becomes more concentrated. While early natives were commonly written as collecting maple syrup, it's really debatable how effective this was and whether it was born out of leisure in a so-called treat, or if it was something they did because collecting the sap helped them actually survive. I suspect it was the latter, something they did because they had time to spend in the early spring during the lull before fields had properly thawed, and it was time to plant again. In reality, it is likely that natives really subsisted off what they had collected in the fall from agricultural crops, hunting, and fishing. It's difficult to fathom that collecting syrup was a necessary ritual for survival, as the energy inputs are exceedingly high. That is, until they got cast iron kettles through trade. Even with 15 taps using modern spiles and pails, we produced only about 4 pails of sap by the end of the one-day cycle. And this was an ideal drip. Drinking it straight would have made sense, but the amount of calories would be nearly negligible and be cancelled out through creation of spiles, boring holes, and collection containers. Certainly, in a homesteading or wilderness living scenario, collecting sap for syrup makes more sense than a one-off survival ordeal because the work can be averaged out over many days, reaping an overall higher return. Once your system is set up, it's only a matter of keeping things going. That said, nature has a way of weeding out ineffective and inefficient. Can a person recuperate the calories they spend collecting and boil sap? We'll return to this question in a second. If you have the time and energy, as the natives did, producing maple candy or maple sugar, which is done through a longer boil, and then letting the result set into a hard candy, is ideal for long-term storage. It's something that can be kept indefinitely and eaten as a treat, added to cooking, or traded and bartered for other necessities. Maple sugar was used by natives to season vegetables, fruits, and fish. It was also mixed into cold water to make drinks. It was really the advancement in technology that permits this form of leisure. Modern-day operations use plastic tubing and negative pressure systems that suck sap right to the evaporator. But even horse and buggy would be a huge asset in hauling the raw materials about on a larger scale. The final boil of sap should be done with care so as not to overboil and burn the syrup. Watch for the sap to begin to stick to the spoon and be sure to stir often. Sap turns to syrup when it reaches 7 degrees Fahrenheit or about 4 degrees Celsius above the boiling point of water. Sap to syrup has a characteristic change where bubbles or froth will form and begin to fill the container. You can watch this happen here. Going too far past this point will cause the syrup to burn or sugar crystals to form, and you will ruin the syrup. Often this happens instantly, 1 minute it's fine and the next is turned into maple sugar or burned, so be careful. To make candy or sugar, even more water is boiled off, allowing it to turn into crystals when cooled. This happens at around 240 degrees Fahrenheit or 115 degrees Celsius. After reaching temperature, allow the candy to cool until it reaches 200 degrees Fahrenheit while stirring constantly. Then immediately place the mixture into a mold or rimmed dish and allow it to cool and harden. Or, if you're not picky like me, just keep stirring it until it hardens into random sugar chunks. Since I didn't have a thermometer, much like the natives, I just paid attention to how the sugar behaved. After my first try, the sugars hadn't caramelized, so I just put it back on the heat and stirred it constantly to make sure it didn't burn. I then removed it and continued stirring until the magical hardening process happened. Once this takes hold, stir the entire lot into hard chunks. This method is the real way natives stored maple sap, because it had no water content, thus discouraging mold growth. Syrup really shouldn't be stored for longer than a month, even with refrigeration. It can, however, be frozen indefinitely. Also keep in mind, as always, that with wild edibles, there is only usually a brief window by which they can be collected. If this season passes you by without taking advantage and processing it and properly storing it, it's gone until the following year. Now for some hard numbers. Over 7 days we collected a total of 140 liters of sap, or 37 gallons. From there we boiled off 136.5 liters of sap, leaving 3.5 liters of syrup. Syrup is about 260 calories per 100 grams, so the total amount of energy produced was around 9,100 calories, or enough energy to fuel a body for about 3.5 days. Naturally, the collection and processing was not a full-time job over those 7 days, but neither did we process by hand all the wood, spiles, buckets, and storage containers, which may very well have been a full-time job for those 3.5 days. The total boiling time by fire was around 17 hours, with another 7 hours over a modern stove for a total boil time of 24 hours. Again, some of this could be done passively, but there still needs to be a full-time operator and wood sufficiently cut to maintain heat on the sap. To suggest that early natives produced maple syrup or maple sugar in any quantity is difficult to fathom, especially if they did so by hollowing a log and tossing in hot rocks to boil off the water, as they are suggested throughout history. It's plausible that they did use sap for cooking in stews and produce some syrup and sugar, as I would suggest a survivalist do. However, I contend that early natives made sap and sugar out of net excess rather than a producer of excess, especially in the early times. In other words, because they had extra sources of food, such as big game including moose, deer, bear, and buffalo, as well as agricultural crops including corn, beans, and squash, they could afford to spend leisure time collecting and processing sap in a spring treat. It really wasn't until natives had access to iron kettles did their methods permit industrialization and efficiency of sap processing. To drive this point home, let's compare syrup to blueberries. Raw syrup only contains 2% sugar, whereas a blueberry contains 14% sugar, 7 times the amount. Drying blueberries only requires exposure to sunlight, which is passive, whereas sap needs to be dried using massive amounts of wood. In other words, it makes more sense to focus effort on blueberries or similar fruit, collect and dry them during the summer and fall, than it is to do the same with maple sap. Historical records suggest that the Chippewa of the Great Lakes region were exporting large volumes of sugar in the 1800s to the Northwest Fur Company as a means of trade. Woodlots were managed by families in small groups. Typical lots would tap around 900 trees. Estimates suggest that a single person can manage around 600 taps by themselves if they are aggressive. The sap was collected and boiled and sugared down as the season wore on. It was reported that they produced around 15,000 pounds of sugar. Some other estimates suggest that exports reach up to 1,000 pounds of sugar per person, which is an astonishing 3 years' worth of calories. Others suggest it was 117,000 pounds of maple sugar. but the numbers become massive at this point. We're talking about 5 million pounds of sap, 120 pounds of sap per tree, and 74,000 trees. Sap to syrup is about 100 gallons, or 378 liters per cordwood. So they'd need around 100 cords of firewood to turn this from syrup to sap. That's a lot of wood. To move that much sap around is 5 million into 123 people for the tribe. 420 man-hours a season is around 90 liters per hour, or 200 pounds of sap per hour per person. Those are some amazing numbers. Knowing this, it's up to you to decide if you think collecting and processing sap was for fun or something natives did to actually improve their survivability. Was collecting sap before cast iron economical, or was it something born out of leisure and simply a fun spring treat? Would natives have produced so much sugar on their own, or was it incentivized through trade for guns, traps, and tools from the West? Would you resort to sap collecting in a survival situation? As always, please leave your comments and thoughts below.